Hi, today I'm going to talk about navigators and preparing for a yacht race, and we're going to use some historical weather data to help us prepare for that race. This is the first in a series of presentations from the Ocean Racing Club of Victoria. Of course, for a navigator there's plenty of things to think about: spares, paper charts, crew lists, batteries, backups, timelines, instrument calibration, servicing, updating software, etc., etc. This is about none of that. This webinar aims to show you the steps to help you prepare using Expedition and historical weather GRIB, and hopefully you'll find this useful. The process requires a reasonable knowledge of Expedition, so shameless plug, it's worthwhile reading the gentle introduction if you don't have a good knowledge of Expedition. So the process I'm going to follow is initially we'll go into Expedition, set the course. I'll add a race note. I'm going to use the Melbourne to Stanley race as the example today. So I'll look at the sail instructions from 2019. I'll load a polar, sail chart and the historical GRIB, which came from the Copernicus website, as you can see at the bottom. I'm going to run multiple routes over 7 days for November 2019. The race is scheduled for a 31st of October start, but the historical GRIB I've got starts on the 1st of November. I'm then going to use the filter function in Expedition to summarize the data. It's a very, very useful feature, but is not used very much, and I think you'll find it really useful. I'll talk about other ways of using that function, and we'll talk about some next steps of what you might do closer to the start and how to use Expedition to help you there. So here I've got my Expedition open and the sailing instructions. I'll start with Expedition. I'm using the Expedition 4D because I've got all my 4D charts and I can run them on multiple computers. It doesn't really matter whether you're using the 4D version or just the standard version. You can see I'm on 11.0.11. It's a good idea to check fairly regularly to make sure you're on the most up-to-date version. You can see I've got the E&C charts here, and in behind I've also got the CMAP charts. I'm going to start by setting the course. Most of you probably have already done this, but I'll just go through it anyway because maybe I'll do it slightly different. On my other screen I've got the sail instructions so that I can see the lat and longs that I'll need. So the first thing is the start, which if we zoom in was at Draper's Reef, and then there was another mark down here, so I've just put a mark at Draper's Reef. I guess I should add that if you go up to settings in the top left and you click on files, here you can pick the mark database that you want to use. If you're just in the one part of the world, that's easy, you just have one mark file. But I go on many different boats, so I have lots of different mark files. The other thing about knowing about this file and naming it is that it means that you can grab that file, having worked on it at home, and take it to the boat. I just point out that that's under Settings, Files. Okay, so I've got a mark file. I've set up the Stanley race, and I've put in Draper's Reef at the beginning. I'll go to Stanley at the finish, and I'll put in that waypoint. Okay, so I've zoomed into Stanley Harbour, and I see that referring to the sail instructions, that the finishing line shall be an imaginary line 75 metres due south of the fixed green light at the end of the breakwater pier, and they've shown me a diagram. So I want to measure 75 metres south from here. Not much use if the distance measurement is in nautical miles, so again I go up to Settings and System, and I change my distance to meters. and it says 75 meters, so I go up to the dividers, I click on set, I put the first point, and then I move 75 meters, so that's already 114, that's 87, 75, okay, 167, the variation is 13 east, so that's alright, and I'm going to put a add new end mark, and I'm going to right click on it because I've created it, edit, and I'm going to call it finish, and it's an imaginary line. I would normally check to see if there's a mark there or not. If there was a mark, I would, in the comment, I would write information about that mark, whether it was yellow, what the flashes were, so that when you just mouse over it, I'll put an example like this, flashing light, if there was one, and I'll lock it, and now when you're trying to finish, when you mouse over it, it just says flashing light, so it just reminds you quickly, you don't have to go back and look in the sailing instructions. And I noticed that they refer to this shallow water just here, so I notice that and make sure that I'm going to remember that when we need it. So now we've got, if we look at edit marks, we've got Draper's Reef. I'm going to come back to that race note I'm going to need to put in, and then I've got the finish. So set active at the beginning, say OK. So now we've got a course, and you can see that straight away the course goes straight over the land here. So I'm going to add a couple of waypoints. Maybe I'll put one in here, and so I'm still on meters, so I'll just measure the distance out from the shallows, so that's 500 meters. And what I'll typically do is I'll start out with a number that is bigger, and then as we get closer, if I feel that it's safe to come closer, then I'll come closer. So now I've already got the finish mark, so I can call this I insert a mark, and it's smart enough to know that you're in between two, so you probably want that one, and that's just off, that's called the nut. So I'll right mouse click, didn't quite get it, wait till I get the little arrow, right mouse click, edit, and I'll say the nut, and just for my reference I'll say 500 meters east. Again, I'll lock it. I'll leave it as a go-to mark for now. By that I mean that I could leave it to port or leave it to starboard. It's so close to the finish, it's fine to leave it as a go-to. So now I'm back at the start. I'll look at the sailing instructions, and this is the race note that I need to create to make sure we avoid it. In practical terms, I would generally start all my routing from here, because this fine detail is something you sort out near the end, and for looking at routing of a course, it's better to start away from the coastal stuff. In the Sydney Hobart, I start at the Sea Buoy, for instance, when I'm doing the routing. Otherwise you deal with complications that you don't really need to. So I just pick a time sometime after the start, having judged approximately how long I think it's going to take to get to the starting point. I'll move these over to my other screen, and then I'll start making the race note. So Sail, and then you can see under Sail you've got Notes. I'll just check what I've got there. I've just got the default race notes. It's empty, so that's great. So I want to create a new note, and the way I start off doing it is I tend to just plonk a few points in. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I press escape, and now I've got an approximate box. Now I refer back to the sail instructions. The first mark is ORCVA, which is the one up here. So I go to that point, I right mouse click, and I go edit race note point, and it says 3816, and what I'm after is 3816.9, so 3816.9, and 144, 38.9, 144, 38.9. Okay, and then I go round each of the points, and I'll do that in the background and then come back to you. Okay, so I've put that in the right place. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on the race note, and I'm going to say edit race note, and I'm going to call it the RIB zone. I'm going to spell it correctly, ZONE. I'm going to say OK. Now I'm going to lock it because there's nothing more annoying than having it move around. So OK, and now if I go up to notes, I can see that it's there. Now I like to have my race notes separated, so I'm going to save this as, and instead of just race notes, I'm going to call it ORCV races. And so now this is just, I'm going to add the race notes that I need for the ORCV races in here. Okay, next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to think about where I want to aim for when I'm leaving to start. So here I want to be some distance. I don't want to be right on the corner because particularly if you happen to be double handing, it's pretty hard to do everything at the same time. So if we go about there and I zoom in, that's 100 meters. So okay, that might be alright. So I go to this mark, unlock it, and I move it there, and I go back. I make sure that I lock it again, and then I just have a look at the course that we've got here. So you can see that it goes straight over, so there needs to be the same thing done up here. Now, at this point, I'm not thinking about the details that you'll have to worry about in terms of current and set and everything else. I'm just trying to actually put a course in. And again, this is insert mark, and that was ORCVA. So I'm going to call it ORCVA. And I'm about 75 meters off, so I'm going to say 75 meters off, and I'm going to lock it, and if I look at the race course, it now goes pretty close to the shallows here, so we also need to be careful of that. But of course you're probably going to be starting out here, so that level of detail I'll leave you to think about. So the next things we need to do, so we've got a simple course in. I would then typically run down the course and just have a look at the dangers. I'd consider how far this distance was while I'm still on meters, so you know, just only 600 meters off there, and I would just check some of those other things like Lonsdale Rock, and I tend to have a file of small things that I need to worry about. So Lonsdale Rock is there. Of course, I would be much happier looking at Lonsdale Rock in the ENC charts. So I've zoomed in, and it's not an issue for most of your boats, but for instance, just say I was worried about here or here. Let's pick Yellowtail. You shouldn't, well no, we'll pick this one. So for me, I might right mouse click and I might just ping it to say, and it matters on some of the boats I'm on, a 4.9, not to mention the sea state. So edit, and I just say rip shallow 0.9, and then I would actually have a range circle on it, and I'd call it so 0.1 is about 200 meters, so 0.05 is 100 meters, so I'll call it 0.05, and now I'll lock it, and so it just gives me a reminder. And then in what I end up with is I go over to here and see I've got ping. I've got Melbourne to Osaka dangers, so I would, having put that into ping, there it is, grip shallows, I just copy it into Melbourne to Osaka dangers. But whatever, you would create a little file that might be Victoria dangers and then copy them in there. And then having done that, you always, well, make sure they're all locked, and then the other thing is, if you say always draw, then those marks will come up even when you're not on that particular route, and that can be quite helpful. Just housekeeping, I'll go back to settings, and under system I'll change meters back to nautical miles. We have a course. The next thing I need to do is check the polar. So sail, polars, and I've loaded under nav because it's the nav that I'm interested in at this point, and that's the polar that gets used by the routing, and I've put in a Beneteau first 40 polar. I've put it in at 95%. Once you get to know your polar, you can decide on the percentage you want to use, but it's not a bad thing to use somewhere more than 90 and under 100 when you're actually trying to do this routing. And then I've got a sail chart. So there are two sorts of sail charts. There's the sailing performance ones that look like that, that's from another boat, and then there's the standard text file. You can look into the book to see how to set these up. These days I always use the sailing performance ones, but this is the one I've got for now. The thing about these is they're binomial, as in here you're on this sail or you're on this sail, and you're on one or the other. Whereas with the K and D ones you can have overlaps, and so what happens is when you're actually doing a routing, if you're right in this slot here between this, in this case the Solent and the J4, then what happens is that it'll attribute, say there's 4 hours of time there, it'll say 2 hours on J4, 2 hours on the Solent. Now we need to load the GRIB. So I go weather, settings, and This is called EC VicTAS November December 2019. Okay, so here's the GRIB. You can see that it's showing hour 0 at 10 o'clock on Friday the 1st, so I'm UTC plus 10, so that's 00 on the 1st, and the end of the GRIB is at 2300 on the 31st of December. So this GRIB will be posted online so that you can grab it and have a go with it yourself. The area that it covers is right down to the bottom of Tassie, so if you end up doing the Melbourne to Hobart, you can probably use this GRIB as an example to help you with doing some of the planning there. So now we've got a GRIB, we've got a course, we've got a polar, and we've got a sail chart. I like to start off and before I do any multi-day routes, to just run a single route and just check that everything's working. We look at the marks. So we've got Draper's Reef, ORCA, ORCV, then the nut and the finish. Now ORCV we leave to port, the nut we sailed straight to it, and finish we sailed straight to it. So what I would like to do in it when I do these things is to test the routing. We will, I'll just move it so you can see, so we'll go optimal settings. We'll start on the 2nd at 0030, so give us 25 minutes to get down to that ORCV, the south of the race note. I'll check all this. I like to load previous optimal routes. I just put 100 because I don't like to lose them. I'm not trying to avoid any land because I want the routing to work without influence from that. If I need to avoid land, I will add a race note. So I don't have any current, but I generally have that ticked. I want to look at the optimal routes, I want to look at the winds on the optimal route, and I want to highlight. I don't need to highlight previous optimal routes. Okay, and I'm not shading at the moment. So starting on the 2nd, and I just check with optimal advanced that I don't have motoring or anything strange ticked, and I haven't got any penalties for tacking or jibing, but sometimes I'll do that, particularly on a Volvo 70 or something where there is a clear penalty every time you do a tack or a jibe. Avoid significant waves over 5 metres. I don't have any wave data, so it's probably not going to impact. Maximum 30 knots, maximum downwind 50, should be fine. Okay, so optimise. I'm going to do both isochronal and grid just to start with. Click on optimise. So I've got a couple of routes. They both look pretty similar. I'll just check the results. Okay, sail charts come in. So everything looks like it's working. The isochronal took a bit longer, often does, but not significant really. And just for this one, just out of interest, it looks like you start off in some sort of southwesterly, there's a shift into the northeast, that takes you out to the east a little, then the breeze comes back to the northwest, and you've got a better angle by having come out to the east with the northeasterly, finish in some sort of light westerly. Alright, so everything looks like it's working. There's no land that I seem to be running into. So now we'll get on to the multiple routing. So I'll clear those. I like the fact that the isochronal routes give it to me in time steps. When you think about routing, it's much easier to run down output and look at time steps rather than distance steps. Alright, I click on multiple So remember, I've got the sail chart in, I've got the polar in, I've got the GRIB. I've got the GRIB set at 105, I think. These are the sorts of things I check. 105. Sail, check the polar. I've got the polar set at 95. I'm happy with that. And that I've got the first 40 polar in. So that all looks good. Now, optimal multiple. Okay, I want to do 7 runs. I want to do them once every 24 hours. I want to start. I'm going to start on the 2nd of November 2019, and I'm going to start at 0030. 0030. Now, it would be possible that, and this is what I do in other parts of the world, that I have 10 years of these historical data sets, so I'm able to look not just at a single year but multi-years. But for the purpose of this exercise, we'll just look at the 1 year. So I change 11 to 1, and then say OK. Okay, so the first thing is it says 0 of 7, so that's a good sign. So now what's happening is it's running a route. The first route leaves on the 2nd of November, just after midnight. Then the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th and 8th of November. So we'll end up with 8 days of routing. And the idea is that you'll go through a weather cycle in that time so that you'll get a sense of the various options that occur. Now in somewhere like the trades, of course, the thing will be very similar because typically the weather patterns are more stable, whereas here it's a cycle. But what I'm really trying to do here is show you some of the tools that are available to you in Expedition. Okay, 6 and nearly done. Okay, so there's the 7 routes. A lot of them, just looking in the, it looks like the predominant is the southwesterly, but there is one which looks a bit similar to what we saw on the first day, so I wouldn't be surprised if that was early in the piece. So if we look at the results, the summary, somewhere between, and it was, you see the second looked like the first one that we ran, and the time 20 hours for that one and 14 hours for the others. So you can look at the individual ones, you can delete some, but for this exercise we'll just take all of the ones that we've got there. So you might look at detail in any of them, but right now we're going to say, okay, we're going to go to the filter button. So click on filter, and what we're doing, it's easier to do it and then show you what we've done, but you can specify the bins that you want. So I typically use 10 degrees for the true wind angle bins, and I use 1 knot for the true wind speed bin. And then we have to give it a name. I'm going to put it in this Melbourne-Stanley directory, so I'll call it November 19 7-day routes Melbourne to Stanley, and then say OK, and then OK. So this has created a text file, and this is it, and I've got my CSV files opening in Excel by default, and so this is what is created by clicking on that filter button. So we've got the 7 routes. The first one started on the 2nd, just after 30 minutes past midnight, and the last one started on the 8th at 30 past midnight. The quickest one was 14 hours, the average was 17, just over 17 and a half, the maximum was 21 hours, and the average distance covered. and you end up with just a 2x2 table. So, and down here you can see the hours on each sail, given that we put a sail chart in, and there was no motoring, which is good. So this is the average time, 17 hours, and you can see the time on each sail. Now, if you have multiple years, it'll give you the average for all the years, and then it'll give you the sails for each year, and that can be quite useful as well. Excel has a fantastic thing called macros, which essentially you just start a macro running and you do a series of keystrokes, and those keystrokes can be saved and then they're repeated. So it's a very simple procedure. It actually writes a program, but you don't need to know how to write the program. But I've got some macros that I've written, and they're set up to deal with the every 1 knot true wind speed and every 10 knot true wind angle. So long as I stick to that, the thing should work. The only problem is when Nick changes something, like adds the motoring down the bottom there, it can upset a little bit, but we'll see what happens. So the first macro I wrote didn't actually have, I forgot something, so I've got it in 2 macros, so I just click on run, and this is a whole series of keystrokes that the thing just goes through, and it makes it into a nice table for me. Now I said that, you see I forgot the percentage time here, so that was the second macro. Now you can look this up and figure out how to run macros, but it's an incredibly helpful thing to do. Now what I've done is I've gone through, I've changed the decimal places, I've said highlight where there's more hours. So what we've got is, for instance, in 27 knots of wind, let's say 29 knots of wind at 100 true wind angle, there's half an hour of time spent there. Now that's a lot of information. So what I've done is I've broken it down into bins here, and so what you can see is that at 11 to 15 knots you spend 2% of the time there, 1.8% of the time 16 20. So it's what is nice is that there's very little upwind work, and a fair bit of reaching, low percentage time spent too windy, although there is always does seem to be some breeze there. And you can see that the sails that get used on average, the A4 gets the highest number of hours, and 21% of the time. So that's the filter function. I think you'll agree it's very helpful. Now I use that filter function when I've got near real-time data, so I'm in the forecasting period for, say, the Sydney and Hobart, and I'll run using the GRIBS that I favour, and this will give me the same output, and it's particularly useful for the crew when they're thinking about what sails we should take, because we'll have a whole suite and we can't take all of them under IRC. The other thing that's useful is considering the time the race is likely to take, and that helps with the provisioning. So hopefully you'll agree this is quite a useful way of summarising large amounts of data. And the final thing that I wanted to show you was as you get closer to the time, how you might use some of the other features in Expedition. So for instance, hopefully a lot of you are using this, but under weather data, if you click on eGRIB, WRF, you've got a series of GRIBs that Nick runs, and they're live. So I don't think you get the highest resolution for Melbourne, but if enough of you are using it, you can agitate, and Nick shifts these things around. But the 1/36th, which is still a very high resolution model, is available for Melbourne. So if we click on Melbourne and download, it's a pretty big file. You can see it. So it's a good thing to download when you're within cell phone range. And under settings, I'll turn off the big GRIB. So now you can see you've got a nice high resolution GRIB. Obviously we've jumped to near real time. And this is, in terms of the free GRIBs out there, it's a really pretty good GRIB and does quite a good job at sea breezes. You can see there it even picks up the breeze penetrating into the bay there. And at a slightly, unfortunately it only extends out that far, but at a slightly lower resolution you can, WRF, you can get Tasmania. So what we'll do is we'll go down here. If you right mouse click here and you say eGRIB, and then Tasmania pops up, shows you what's available, and then click download. And so what you can do is you can use the two in concert to do the routing. So you can have the two GRIBs in, you can have the high res GRIB and then this slightly lower res GRIB, and they're particularly useful. And hot off the press, it's not live yet, and with the coronavirus at the moment, they're not sure when it's going to happen. But if you click on eGRIB area and you pick an area that you want, I'm just testing this at the moment, but hopefully it'll go live soon. It looks like we're going to be able to get the European model, and this is going to be great. You can get it every 3 hours, and I think it goes out 144 hours, and you get mean sea level pressure, wind and rain. So if we download, I think it's still active for another few days, but this will be licensed to individual copies of Expedition, so you'll have to pay for it obviously, but it's going to be a game changer. The data are so good that I think it'll be a no-brainer to use it. So if we right mouse click there, we look at a Meteogram, you can see goes through to the 23rd of April. So I hope you found this helpful, and that you log in and find some other courses as we move forward in the future. Thanks very much. Cheers.